I feel really privileged to have this incredible panel of guests here at the Festival Tomorrow. We've been going 5 years now, and we're doing incredible work with the local people and families. And actually, we want to really take advantage of the fact that we have some incredible organisations based right here in Swindon. And I describe Swindon as being the hub of science and research in the UK. Primarily because we have UKRI here, but we are also fortunate to have people like the Science Museum and others here that put us in a really interesting place and a neutral position. So if you're to do something, in Manchester or Leicester, any place where they have a university, it's kind of associated with that university. We're the only county without a university, I think, in the whole of England, and the biggest conurbation without university. But it means that actually we can kind of take neutral ground and get people together, so we can be a bit more controversial. So hopefully you do a bit of that. So today we're talking about art and science and how they mix, partly because of a question you might remember from this lady here last year who asked, why isn't there more art at this festival? So I'll just quickly go down the panel and ask each one to just introduce themselves and a little bit kind of where how they've got here, who they are, before we get into the debate. We'll stop for Q&As partway through. If anyone has any questions, put your hand up, and we'll save some time at the end as well. That's okay? Super. Good. Oh, audience feedback already, Mike. Thank you. So first introduce Professor Dame Ottoline Leyser.
Thank you very much. It's always great to be here. I love this festival, so I'm very pleased to be here again. I am the Chief Executive Officer of UKRI, which was introduced. We are the biggest public sector funder of research and innovation in the UK. We have a budget of in excess of £8 billion a year to invest in research and innovation right across all the disciplines. So we include the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but also the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council and everything else. So it's a very interesting discussion to be having in the context of how our investment portfolio really works across that piece.
Roger.
So I'm Roger Highfield. I'm the Science Director of the Science Museum Group, and we're a group of 5 museums. And actually, our history goes all the way back to the Great Exhibition in 1851. There was something called the South Kensington Museum, which more than a century ago was split up to become the Science Museum and the V&A. And for me, it's kind of fascinating that science and art were absolutely joined at the hip in the 19th century. And then something weird happened in the 20th century, and they were perceived as separate things, when I suppose one thing I feel passionately about is I hate the two cultures narrative. We're in one culture with art as a subjective pole and science as an objective pole. Above us, you can see.
I mean, I asked Roger to introduce himself, and we're getting arguments already.
So just very quickly, over our heads, you can see some of the old portraits of inventors and so on, which are formed the very early Science Museum collection. We've got about 15,000 works of art, but we've also, commissioned poetry, dance, plays. We've worked with people like Thomas Heatherwick, David Hockney, Zaha Hadid, and we've been commissioning art for about 30 years now in many different forms. So we see it as a very important access point for just to enable people to engage with science in a whole different way.
Thank you. So that's Roger Highfield.
Sorry, I went on a bit there.
Tim, can you introduce yourself? This is another amazing organisation. People say, why do you love Swindon? I go through the people I've worked for in Swindon, and you just go, they're just amazing organisations. So.
Hi there. So I'm Tim Jenkins. I am Head of External Affairs at the UK Space Agency. And it's our role to help catalyse investment in the UK space sector, which is worth over £17.5 billion, to deliver missions and capabilities, so putting things up in orbit to create effects down here to help improve life for people and planet, but also to champion space. Our role is to communicate why space matters to the public, to business, to academia. And it does matter. If you look at climate change, one of the big challenges we face as a planet, the majority of the ways of, certainly the best ways of measuring climate change, temperature changes in the seas, are using Earth observation data from satellites. So it really does matter to the future of the planet how we communicate about that work. And I want to focus today, if I'm allowed to by the rest of the panel, on art as storytelling, how we tell the story of science and, from my point of view, space science.
Our final panellist, who when I talked to him before this session, I said, "What do you want to talk about?" He said, "I just want to cause trouble." So I've put him at the end.
So I can be easily removed.
Near the door. Yeah. So, Phil.
Hello, I'm Phil Gibby. I'm the Southwest Director for Arts Council England. I am not a scientist, I should add. I've just about scraped biology and physics O-levels, but failed chemistry. Neither am I an artist, I should say, working for the Arts Council. My day job, I'm a hatchet-faced bureaucrat who likes spreadsheets and risk analysis. So it's on that sort of basis that I joined you today. Arts Council England.
That sounds fascinating.
We do our best. Arts Council England is a public body. We are one of the arm's length bodies of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And we do three things. We advocate for arts, museums and libraries. We work with partners to develop new ambitions for arts, museums and libraries. And we invest through two sources, granting aid from Treasury, and we're a National Lottery good cause. So we invest also in arts, museums and libraries. Swindon is a priority place for us. We are enormously enthusiastic about the prospects for what can happen in Swindon over the next few years. And the Festival of Tomorrow is something we're very proud to support as part of our ambition around here.
Thank you, and thank you for your support. So I want to just actually, so Ottoline, you had some thoughts on where does this divide come from? Why do we think there's a science and arts divide?
I think it's already been, slightly mentioned. I think it's a bit of a historical accident that came from the kind of Enlightenment, rapid uptick in the pursuit of understanding our world through a particular lens in the context of, then Industrial Revolution, all of those kinds of things. And that, I think, resulted in a kind of professionalization that accidentally then isolated the different parts. And listening to people have said a number of interesting things, but I'm not going to pick up on Roger's yet. I'm going to pick up on this one. I'm not a scientist. Everybody is a scientist. Being a scientist is really only about being a person. It's about, curiosity and creativity and inspiration and wanting to understand how the world around you is and how you might be able to intervene in some way to make it better in some very broad sense of the word. And from my point of view, all of the disciplines can map into that same space. And the notion that there are some kind of clean divide is just not sustainable with the evidence, in my view. And it's much more about the kinds of questions in which people are interested than it is about anything that goes around that. And obviously there's spectra across the whole piece, but it's the notion of a fundamental difference, I think, is not right.
I mean, that may be true, but you still divide them into different councils, don't you, in the UKRI? So there's a kind of a thing going on.
So I can say several things about that. Obviously, there is a corpus of knowledge that goes historically with disciplines that embeds our thinking about those things into schools. I actually think the school curriculum is far too segregated as well. I think it is necessary to think about, to divide things up. You can't just have one enormous amorphous thing. It's hard to build the kinds of relationships you need to understand the ground floor investment in those disciplines that you need. But I would say that within UKRI, within that £8 billion, you can think about that budget in thirds, effectively. A third goes through the combination of Innovate UK, which is a business-focused activity, and Research England, which is a university-focused activity. So they are completely discipline agnostic. They're about a sector. A third is in those disciplinary research councils looking after the health of those disciplines, including the interaction between them and other things. And we now manage a third of the budget collectively in a way that allows us to capture all of that cool stuff going along across the disciplines and sectors to do things that are pan-disciplinary, cross-disciplinary, supra-disciplinary, whatever you want to call them. And that you've got to divide things or you can't operate, but you shouldn't divide things in a way that creates silos.
Okay.
Actually, that's absolutely fascinating. I just want to come in on the two points really. First of all, on the professionalisation of science as a discipline, and how that could be potentially excluding people from the conversation and from entering into a world of science or space exploration. Because certainly in the space sector, we have a challenge with getting people doing STEM subjects. That's obviously across the board of all science and technology sectors. But also even those people who do have a science or engineering background don't feel they can do a space career. It's for rocket scientists. That is a saying that means it's too smart for you. And actually that can be quite, it can exclude a lot of people from what is actually becoming an increasingly accessible sector. I am, like others on the panel, I am not a scientist, but I am still a science communicator.
I'll be forced to say we're all artists in a minute, and then anything might happen.
Absolutely. But I am not in the modern professional sense, not a scientist. However, I still have a thirst for knowledge, and I'm here as a space science communicator. So I think there is a point to be made that actually technology, both digital communications technology, but also the sort of applications and devices that can go into a rocket to put a satellite into space are now very accessible for a large number of people. You don't have to be a large corporate prime to send something into space. There's an increasing number of entrants into the market using very often off-the-shelf materials and applications. So there is a sense in which, and I suppose this is more a question to the panel, is technology making science and art more accessible for a larger number of people? But also just to go back to that point about the origins of it. And there is this idea, I think it's from Thomas Petit, known as the Gutenberg parenthesis, that the creation of mass literacy suddenly meant that knowledge was separate from the knower. It could be separated. You could have something compared to. You had objectivity. And that meant there's less room for that subjective storytelling, that relationship between the storyteller and the audience, the way we used to communicate prior to that period. And the reason why it's a parenthesis rather than simply a line is that he theorizes that digital technology has meant that we are going back to communicating in that subjective, in that relationship fashion, and that is changing our relationship to how we decide, what is truth and real, how we engage with art, how we express ourselves, and how we understand our universe.
Oh, thank you. Did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I just want to make the general point. I think science through technology is probably the biggest force of change in culture today. I could see Ottoline cringing at my objective and subjective poles of one culture. And I've got a very generous definition of culture. I accept, for example, there are different chimpanzee cultures out there, and there's been beautiful work to show that. It's just things that people do. And I also think there's lots of lovely examples of crosstalk between what we define as artists or scientists or mathematicians, in that we had an exhibition a few years ago showing time-lapse photography of Muybridge and others, which obviously inspired the Italian futurists. We used to have Henry Moore coming in to look at exhibits in our old maths gallery. If you look at our new maths gallery, Zaha Hadid was inspired by modelling airflows over an aircraft
we've got that,
and so on. Have we got that? I'm not sure we've got it in this, unless you added it at the end. Oh, brilliant. Oh, yeah, well, that would be lovely, because I love, we could have had we could have filled Wembley Stadium with, if you go back one. So this is the plane at the heart of the gallery. And we could have filled Wembley Stadium with Arbel and Fields medalists and said, design a mass gallery. And they would say, it's got to have a lot of equations. And she had the brilliant idea of taking an old aircraft, the first to be designed, understanding airflows and so on for short takeoff and landing, simulating the flows around the craft, and then having these great swooping spaces in the gallery inspired by the airflow. So actually, the gallery itself is kind of, it's an architect's vision, and it's kind of crystallized mathematics. And again, another example of the crosstalk, we had Andrew Wiles talking about Fermat's last theorem. And when you talk to pure mathematicians about their process of creation and discovery, it's rather profound. And he talked about a bit like being in a capability brown garden and turning round a corner and seeing a whole new vista opening up, because he could see connections between different branches of maths before. And I'm actually with Ottoline in the sense that there's just as much creativity in pure maths as there is in art. And there is this amazing crosstalk going on the whole time.
You were told before you weren't allowed to agree with each other, so...
Sorry, forgive me.
On a debate, I do obviously absolutely buy that as a narrative. So scientific inquiry drives artistic engagement. And you only have to look at artists like Luke Jerram, with whom some of you might be familiar, who's done those extraordinary things like we've got up there somewhere. He's done scale models of the moon and the Earth and Mars, which there it is, which has been length and breadth of the UK and internationally. And Luke's done a lot of other work, which is perhaps less high profile, but he's taken sort of biological molecules of the common cold and all sorts of other germs and made glorious glass casts of them, and done incredibly well to open up what might feel like complex scientific ideas through the medium of art. So that's great. But I think there is also a risk, and the Arts Council, I think, is, this is something that's on our mind all the time, that just because a work of art refers to science doesn't make it a great work of art. And I'll give you an example from a couple. And I live in fear. This is where you'd like to know the background of everybody in the room so that you have an idea that it's a safe space. But this is a piece of work that the Arts Council did fund, so it's a personal view. Colleagues did see the merit of it in the round. But it was a piece of work that you might have found in the courtyard at Somerset House a few years ago. It was called Pollution Pods. And for those of you who are, sort of familiar with the work of Buckminster Fuller and his notion of geodesic domes, Pollution Pods was 5 huge intersecting geodesic domes in the courtyard of Somerset House, and it's been to a lot of other places as well. And within each of those 5 domes, he'd worked with scientists to carefully pump through a blend of air with a certain degree of chemicals that sought to accurately reflect the air quality, firstly, in a small town somewhere in Scandinavia, secondly, in London, thirdly, I think, in Delhi, then in Beijing, and then in Sao Paulo. So you could walk through the 5 geodesic domes and get a sense of how pollution differed from place to place. And, theoretically, that's not a bad idea. As a work of art, I would say it is profoundly limited. It looked like a very, very bad reinterpretation of the Eden Project in the middle of Somerset House. It went to the United Nations. It went to COP25. It went to COP26. Greta Thunberg thinks it's fantastic, and it's one of the relatively few times I've disagreed with Greta Thunberg. And my argument simply is that it's not that it's bad and these things should be stopped, but I don't think it caused one person to engage or think more actively about the impacts of climate change and the challenges that we face in the world. And for me, investing in art that doesn't really invite that inquiry feels like a poor decision.
Yeah. I think years ago, when I was studying science communication, sci-art was just people constantly saying sci-art. It was just a thing.
Yeah.
And there was a huge amount going into sci-art.
Yeah.
It wasn't always brilliant.
I've got to say, I so agree. I mean, I've got an example. We had an exhibition in our Manchester Museum called Wonder Materials. And we worked with Random International, a kind of collective, to come up with they came up with this video wall which just showed concrete being crushed. And we know that they spent ages sort of being inspired by the fact that you can isolate graphene, this two-dimensional layer of carbon atoms, using sellotape and pulling a layer off graphene. But I must admit, when we saw the final installation with this thing grinding away, I just thought, what has this got to do with graphene? I just didn't get and they did explain to me over about 20 minutes. I still can't really remember what they said. And I do think, if you go to places like the Venice Biennale or even Tate Modern, I have to say, I do find them more funny than they are profound, in that the international art speak is a kind of terrible barrier, this narrative that we're here to pose questions. And this one posed one question to me, which is, what on earth has this got to do with graphene? Whereas meanwhile, we had Lem Sissay writing a poem about graphene in his usual kind of exuberant style, and that was much more engaging. So I agree. The idea that art and science always leads to a fruitful offspring, healthy, exciting, is not, there's an awful lot of, but I'm being very subjective here, and I'm sure many people love that random international thing.
How dare you be subjective?
I think some of these issues come from, you start with the foundation that these are two completely different things, and science is very, very difficult, and you need to make it easier to engage with. So let's bring art, which is very, very easy, stick them together, something will... the entire logic underpinning that is just deeply flawed and reinforces the false dichotomies that I think we see out there. So, in the end, there are kind of two elements to it. There's the ideas. There's, what is this? How does it work? How can I do something cool with it? Which is, universal. And people enjoy having those ideas and sharing those ideas, the mathematicians, whoever they are. They enjoy having the ideas, and as I say, they really enjoy sharing them, because we're also social creatures and we like to communicate about these things. And indeed, increasingly, the best ideas come from those interactions, where you put different things together to get a new idea. And so inherently, that storytelling element is deep in both sorts of ideas, because we communicate in stories. That's how it's deep in how we think about things, and that is both wonderful and something to be grasped. Anyone who's ever written a scientific paper writes it as a story. You do. It's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or people can't engage with it. And that's really important, but also has limitations, because most of the really interesting things are not linear. They have feedbacks and all the rest of it. So a big challenge is how we communicate those more dynamical systems that are the things, the things we need to understand for climate change and epidemics and all of that kind of stuff. And so, have ideas, share the ideas, universal, really exciting and human, and also brings people together in a way that allows you to formulate solutions. I think that's the other key thing about this. How can you make, what is it? How does it work? How can you make it better? How can you solve the problem? How can you use it to do something useful? And where I think we're having challenges with some of these climate change communications is they're just a little bit too much doom, gloom, the world is ending. And that is quite dangerous as an underpinning message, because it drives people away rather than draws people in. And with things like that, everybody really can make a material difference by doing their thing. So we need those empowering communications rather than the runaway screaming communications, which are less engaging.
And it's exactly the same with things like artificial intelligence as well. Oh my God, we're all going to die and have to live off-grid in a remote community in Connemara in order to save ourselves. It's not a helpful way of understanding how AI can bring incredible numbers of positive benefits to the world. So there's all of that. Just in that spirit of how you bring together artists, scientists, technologists, I think, sort of for those of you who might be familiar with Watershed in Bristol, which is, it's a cultural cinema, it's a a very nice bar, and it's also out the back got the pervasive media studio. And we're really proud to invest in Watershed and in the work in pervasive, and you know, a very, very wide range of other bodies invest in it too. And what pervasive does is offer free or affordable desk space to artists, to scientists, to technologists, to people from all manner of disciplines. And they get to work there in this big open plan space. And the underpinning principle is everybody is interruptible and everybody is willing to share. So if you are scientists or you're sort of working on particular theories or ideas, and you don't really have a sense of how to communicate them better, you will be surrounded by artists with whom you can just simply have informal conversations. That might lead to something, it might not. But there is a way of working in that space that I think really does go some way to repairing that false dichotomy of arts are over here and science is over there, and the idea that a single common conversation is possible. And I think for me, the future is very much about, you know, sort of how do we take spirit of Watershed and multiply that across the cultural sector and across art, science and technology as a whole.
Okay. I want to pause and just in case there are any questions from the audience before we carry on. Yeah? I'll give you the mic, not for our benefit, but for the recording.
So I wondered if you had any examples of kind of more participatory arts and science. And I was also thinking about participatory arts in general being quite a kind of, well, I'm thinking of sort of social science rather than science and STEM. So I didn't know if that is just sort of part of the conversation. But participatory arts and social science seems to already be in connection.
Do you want to take that?
Gosh, I mean, it depends really how you define. You know, we've had events in the museum where, so for example, we wanted to do this Elates on the science of consciousness, which sounds quite a kind of hardcore, abstruse. You know, we can't even define consciousness. What we came up with was a zombie lab Lates, where we tried zombies for a crime, and then you got interesting discussions about agency and consciousness that way. And then we got the audience to vote on it. What was also fun was we actually gave them lessons about how to walk like a zombie. I think about 7,000 people turned up. They queued all the way down to the tube station in South Kent. Half of them were dressed as zombies, and it was quite a sight, you know. And I think, you know, in that sense, we now whether you count that as art, it was like kind of cosplay, I guess. But there are things like that where I think you can get really exciting, you know, kind of collaborations going. And we actually did. I think there was a paper that came out from, I think a bunch of game theorists did the zombie trial. So it actually did lead to a bit of science in the literature as well, which is nice.
Thanks, Rod. Phil, I assume from your response about AI earlier on, you think AI has a role to play in science development. Does AI have a role with art?
Yes, it does, but it is both benefit and risk, I suppose. We had this conversation, we convened a debate in our team about 6 months ago on this because it was becoming such an emerging issue for us that we felt we needed to explore it. And you know, sort of, obviously, we know what some of the major strengths and factors of AI are, and the ability to read across data sets and accumulate a density of knowledge that can better inform artistic practice or many other facets of public life. So that's great. There are some monumental risks, I think, from a cultural perspective around AI, which are particularly from my perspective to do with copyright and how AI is ultimately regulated and by whom feels like probably the single biggest existential challenge to the cultural sector at the moment. Because if you can't retain notions of intellectual property and copyright and patent and so forth around ideas, because they're just being aggregated and exploited again and again and again, fewer and fewer artists are going to get paid, and the sector will only ever diminish. The other thing that AI is doing is so many artists and people working in the cultural sector don't have one job, they have portfolio careers. So if, for example, you are a writer and half the week you freelance as a journalist on the local newspaper, or you're a copywriter for an ad agency, if AI is going to be doing 80% of that work in the next 5 years, how are you going to make a work as a writer setting out on a career? So we're nervous, but that's not a reason to shy away from seeing what the benefits might be.
Thank you. Good morning, all. First of all, can I say it's always such a pleasure to hear from interesting and intelligent people who are speaking freely about a very interesting subject. So thank you for that. I was a lawyer, and lawyers get bound up in definitions quite a lot. And I'm fascinated by the discussion that has some relevance around the boundaries between art, culture, science, might I add, heritage. And I want to say a few words about an area that I'm a fan of. I'm a Swindon fan, not so much Swindon town, although I used to work for them, but the town of Swindon, that I think should be a city, given its size. And some of you will be aware of the relatively new initiative of Magic Swindon, which has agonised to an extent about art and culture, and should that involve heritage. And what I'm going to ask you all is whether you think, generally, but particularly in the context of the town I'm a fan of, and Magic Swindon, whether there might be some advantage in, for that purpose, taking the fences down and saying, look, this is about culture, and that is about science and technology, and Swindon dance, and Swindon ice hockey, and Lydiard Park and Lydiard House, and performing arts, and pop groups that play in the local pubs. And I think if we approach it like that, and we all do so with respect for the other guy's point of view, whether it's objective or subjective, we might make some serious progress in this town. I hope we can work constructively from the bottom up with our elected politicians. We've got some astonishing individuals and organisations in this town, and I hope that together we can make Swindon really hum and meet your faith in us as an ambitious place to be.
I think that's for you, Phil.
But I'll start, but really interested in others' views on this. Thanks, Mike. That was really helpful to hear. As per the conversation we've been having so far, I am always in favour of taking down the barriers and the false distinctions. So one of the underpinning principles of arts and culture is its interest in inquiry across all things. So distinctions between arts and heritage, or arts and science, or arts and greengrocery, or whatever. They're all false. Everybody's territory is everybody's, and I'm really comfortable with that. Obviously, for administrative purposes, you have to put certain parameters around. So you could say, well, art and sport, that's a single thing, isn't it? There's common ground, I think, to be found around areas such as dance and well-being and so forth in that space between arts and sport, but at some stage you have to draw a line. Ultimately, you should start wide and then work out where the best opportunities are. But I'm a great believer in Magic Swindon, which I think is a really ambitious, forward-looking agenda, which I think will do well. But I am also, I think, working across, you think of the different DCMS areas, like, we're not responsible for film, that's BSI, we're really interested in that stuff. We're not responsible for heritage, that's Heritage Fund and Historic England, we're really interested in that stuff too. So hiding behind false distinctions won't enable us to fulfil our potential.
Just speaking with I formerly come from Visit Britain, the tourist body, another DCMS arm's length body. And certainly when you look at place branding or nation branding, really, as an outsider, you aren't really making that distinction yourself. You don't visit a place because purely it's built heritage, but not its intangible heritage. You don't visit somewhere because of its art gallery, but not its wider social and cultural elements as well. So when you're looking at how international visitors see the UK or see a particular location, that's part of a wider brand. They will have a wider picture of the different components that make up the nature. And for want of it, it's a horrible word, particularly for the artist in the room, but the brand, if you like, of a particular locale. So, consumers don't see the distinction. So when you're considering the promotion of an area, you shouldn't either.
Roger?
I mean, I just want to make the general point that, scientists love talking about interdisciplinarity and multidiscipline and so on, and just to include art in the mix. And just to give you one, sorry to give you lots of Science Museum Group propaganda, but one thing I thought was a lot of fun was about a decade ago in Nature, they unveiled, actually I can't seem to get this video working, I'm not sure how to get it to go, but anyway, they unveiled the ENCODE Consortium's data, which is basically looking at the regulatory regions in DNA. You and Bernie, the person behind it, came to me and said, we want to wrap we got so much data, we want to print it out and wrap the Science Museum in the data. We couldn't do that for pretty obvious reasons, but a colleague of mine, Ling Li, realized that when he described how the regulatory, how the way DNA was regulated works, where it's wrapped up around thick structures called histones, and they actually affect how the DNA code is read, she got a series of aerial silk dancers. Each dancer represents a histone, and they spiraled around in a way in the direction that the real histones would have done, and they were completely inspired. The dance was inspired by what was happening in the molecular level to explain the ENCODE Consortium's data. And it was a sort of unexpected collaboration. So all I'm just saying is that when it comes to magic, magical things can happen if you get a very broad team and not just scientists and technologies, but artists as well in the room.
Mm-hmm.
This is magic. I mean, I don't know. This is just lovely. I just want to echo what that man over there said. Just talking with people calmly about fascinating things. And I don't know what it was like when Rod proposed the idea of a science festival. So much is bound up in language. When I proposed the idea of a literature festival in Swindon, the civic leader said that word was too long for Swindon. It wouldn't work. And so Rod, with his two-syllable word, science, probably got a much better reception. And actually, what's interesting is that it succeeded like mad, and it succeeded with people of all generations. And it is the trouble with language that it's a double-edged sword. And actually, all children want to find out about things. All children want to draw things. So really my question is, and this is just bloody lovely. It's just lovely, lovely, lovely. More. And even though Swindon is Britain's largest town without a place of higher education, as Rod mentioned, that makes it fertile ground. There's so much we can do here. But my question is, bearing in mind that I found you at the Literature Festival that the best artists and the best scientists always get on really well with one another. So there's some sort of middle ground that polarizes things, that pigeonholes and separates us, and we must beware that. But my question is, how can we catch them young with art and science without separating those two things? In other words, education.
Getting Robin Ince into the schools after last night.
Well, we have Marcus de Sortoy coming to the festival this year, who is a brilliant example of someone who can tell a story and loves mathematics. Brings the two together, brilliant.
And actually is theatrical. He did a play for the Science Museum called X and Y years ago, which went to Manchester as well. And he really is exceptional. The last time I saw him was in the Maldives with a plastic brain on his head, dancing like a whirling dervish to Jai Ho with a screening of Slumdog Millionaire. There, I just thought bizarre fact to throw in there. But he's amazing, actually. Writes brilliantly, brilliant popularizer of mathematics, brilliant mathematician, and does plays as well.
But I think we need to go beyond that, because it's not about clever, charismatic people. If we have to rely on clever, charismatic people, we're not going to get anywhere. It is about taking down all of these barriers, and I think that does include curriculum reform so that the subjects are less... I mean, at the moment, in secondary school, the way curricula are designed is to be as non-overlapping as possible. And that is clearly insane. I'm quite excited about the opportunities actually from data science, which are currently being sold as a science, when data science and data analytics, they need to be everywhere. Everybody needs to be able to code. Everybody needs to be able to get their head round the data that, as we've just heard, are in a deluge for all of us. And it's very empowering to feel that you have tools to understand data. So embedding things like that across the curriculum, I think, would begin to take down some of those barriers and bring people together and give people the kind of tools they need for the 21st century, which are much less about do you know these things and much more about how do you adapt to new things because of the rate of change.
Do you want to take a bit more on that, Phil? And then I've got a few questions from our online audience as well.
Yeah, so I couldn't endorse that more. I think that how do we make that difference? That curriculum reform is absolutely where this begins and ends, I think, for me. But there are other measures beyond that as well, I think. So for me, there's something around, I'm not enough of a higher education specialist to remember what the terminology is, but there's a methodology by which degrees and their value is reckoned up, if you like, and disproportionately, I think that creates a distinction in favour of science and technological degrees and away from arts and humanities. A review of that whole way of appraising the value of degrees, I think, is a really important thing. Looking at how apprenticeships can be restructured so they better meet the needs of the creative and cultural industries. That's an essential part of this. The government has something at the moment called the Creative Careers Campaign. I think rebooting that in conjunction with all of the other things feels really, really important to us. And also, this is less of a education-related thing, but I think it's all on the same continuum. We're sort of in advance of the general election, making the case for cultural tax reliefs to be retained at the higher level, which we think is absolutely important. The other thing that really, really needs to happen is the current tax relief around R&D is really difficult for cultural and creative industries to access, and the reframing of that so that new ideas, that experimentation and playfulness can just be made real is another vital part of that dimension, I think.
I think there should be more funding for playfulness, generally.
Yeah.
So we've got some audience online. I want to make sure some of their questions come through as well. So one from Oana saying, do you have any advice for starting fruitful collaborations between art and STEM or STEAM? And I don't know if that's about funding or if that's about how to make sure we don't end up with something that's kind of a painful bit of sci art. Take that question wherever you'd like.
I mean, it could sort of add in a little bit about why in chunks of the communities there is still this anxiety and antagonism that makes that question a kind of relevant question almost. And I fundamentally, I think it's partly the silos, so people haven't encountered one another in the way that they need to and are not sufficiently relaxed about a shared language that you can use. But it's partly about insecurity. So, STEM people are frightfully clever, and I don't want, I don't understand that. I don't feel secure talking to those people. And the other way around, because there is this counter narrative that people have forgotten about, which is that STEM people are kind of nerdy people who are not interested in proper culture and arts and all the rest of it. And that is utterly encoded into the two cultures CP Snow narrative, and it is very destructive because it creates an insecurity that then feeds on itself. And that further then in today's world embeds the notion of competition. And, it's not fair, they've got more money than we've got. And then you're, again, in that inappropriate place. So the main thing you need to build the right collaborations is confidence. It's stepping forward, knowing you're bringing something, everybody else is bringing something, you want to hear what they've got, they want to hear what you've got, and then cool things will happen. And that's the primary underpinning platform on which to have those very broad and exciting interdisciplinary conversations.
Do you agree with that from the Science Museum, the kind of best?
I mean, we kind of bake art commissions into our bigger projects, and we see it as very important. So trying to see if I can find some examples here, but like our medicine galleries, I love this. This is Bloom by Studio Rosso, And it's a series of little propellers of different colours. Each colour represents a different virus. It was commissioned pre-pandemic. And you can see that the red colours and sort of whirling propellers propagate through this network more quickly than green and other colours. And I watched a school group trying to make sense of it the other day, and I thought it was such a lovely embodiment of the way that it sounds creepy to use the word lovely in the sense of a virus propagating through a population and so on. But I thought it was such a great and interesting response to, it's in a part of the medicine gallery is about community medicine, and it was about finding the right collaborator and having a mission always to include art as part of the offer. And there's at least half a dozen things. Maybe the biggest one is the Quinn commission here, Self-Conscious Gene, 3.5 meters tall, with Rick Ganest, who tattooed his whole body when successfully treated. He's holding a book of anatomy where we've actually got the actual book in our collections. And it's a tactile object. You're encouraged to touch it. And it's a very, to use Walt Disney speak, Disney used to talk about weenies, as in, we need to see that. If you're in Disneyland, you see the Cinderella's castle, we need to see that. This is our kind of weenie at the start of the medicine galleries. You want to go over, you want to look at it, you want to touch it, you want to find out who is this person, why did they tattoo their bodies? So we just see it as a very important way of providing extra kind of access points to science and technology in our bigger galleries.
Yes, I think there's always a danger when you have a project where you're bringing together art and science, or any kind of STEM subject, that the art becomes the means for the science end. And that's a bad way to start that sort of collaboration. There has to be that shared objective. You both have to have both a scientific and artistic objective in mind that you share, that you're working towards. And again, this speaks to this siloization and breaking it down. So baking that in right at the start of your project is incredibly important for those sorts of collaborations.
I think I've found with we've had the arts broadly in the festival from day one, probably more consciously since we're with Arts Council and the funding. But sometimes it's just the consciousness that kind of can be quite key. But the thing that we found really is just the slightly scary notion of losing control, really, and that kind of the thing that draws, if you think of a family tree and science and arts somehow splitting, if you take one step back, it's creativity. And in school, science is not very creative. It's here, do these things, and if you do it right, you'll get the right answers. Whereas art is very, here's some paper, make a mess. When you're very young, it changes. But I think what I've found is when people come to us, it's that kind of going, I've no idea what you're talking about because it's completely outside of my experience and field. I've no idea if there's an audience for that, but go on, let's do that. So it's a little bit about losing control and being arms open, I think, is how I found the best collaborations. I've got a very practical question, actually, from Rosie online, who's just asking for advice on careers currently available that involve science and arts. So are there careers that you can pursue that bring them together deliberately?
Lots.
I mean, we do events across our 5 museums, and a lot of them will have some sort of participatory pop-up element. We're already thinking about the Bradford Science Festival next year. There's a thing called the Born in Bradford study, a big medical study of children born in Bradford, and we're already thinking about how to commission around that. And I think you can get involved in our lates and so on as a volunteer, and that might give you a little glimpse behind the curtain of some of these sorts of activities that might help. Science festivals, again, often crucibles of the two communities.
I'm a big fan of people volunteering at science festivals.
Very quick, really exciting area is this very broad area of the creative industries, which is inherently incredibly multidisciplinary and very much a kind of hotbed of technological innovation to produce a whole range of things, be that theatre or art installations or whatever. And it's very exciting watching that, and it's a massive growth industry in the UK.
Anything to add? So I wanted to get a little bit. Are there any other burning questions? Yes, go on. And then I think there'll be questions at the end if I left it. If you're happy to just go with questions.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about the current funding models and whether that actually encourages this dichotomy where everyone has to bid for their funding. And if you're not quite arty enough, you can't bid in the arty pots. And if you're not quite sciencey enough, you can't bid in the sciencey pots. And they're competing against each other for more and more limited funding. And whether that sense of competition is part of the problem.
That's an interesting one. I tried to see if there's funding for my science communication masters, and I was told by one side, no, that's humanities, and the other side, no, that's science. So I faced that problem.
But, I mean, this is part of the underpinning rationale for the creation of UKRI, and we're relatively new still, bringing together all of those things I talked about earlier, and we are moving more and more to having the right mix of pots of money. So you do need disciplinary pots of money, you need kind of interdisciplinary pots of money, but then you also need, so we're now running open bids for research projects that have, that by definition don't fit in a pot. I mean, that's the qualification for bidding into that is not having anywhere else to bid. So, so you can't, so you absolutely get over this idea that you're not in this one or that one because you've got a fully flexible one. So I think that is an issue, but I think it's a fixable issue.
I suppose looking at it from a different perspective, art doesn't necessarily mean commissions. So, for example, in our Bradford Sister Museum, we wanted to do a Doctor Who exhibition, and we found that there was an enormous amount of Doctor Who fan art. people building their own Daleks and goodness knows what. And we put on an exhibition around, we went out in the community and saw, it was fun to look at their kind of artistic response to this amazing sci-fi franchise. So you don't necessarily have to go through that bidding for funding route.
Phil, Arts Council?
Yeah, so I don't think it's the structures necessarily of a challenge. So our main open fund is called Project Grants, and sort of anyone can apply and so forth. I think where the arts connect with anything else, whether it's science, technology, or any other field, we won't necessarily have the expertise in-house to be able to make those decisions in the round. So what is it we need to do as grant makers to access that sort of expert witness, if you like, to enable us to make a good decision around an application? I think that's an emerging area for us and many other funders as well.
So I'll take one more question, then I'll ask the panel for any closing thoughts, so they can think about that whilst also thinking about the question. Ooh, you're going to fight it. You take it. I mean, it's your fault we're having this debate.
Thank you so much. I'm loving the fact that we've moved from a very sort of, from a discussion about just having that dialogue across boundaries as a concept to very practical solutions of how the dialogue can be enabled. And so the question I have, considering we don't have that much time, is whether from our amazing panelists could maybe give us one more example of those practical, from your organisations, practical solutions for catalysing or enabling more cross-disciplinary collaborations, that sort of pervasive media studio sort of approach of you can come and disturb me at my desk and have a conversation, etc. In this context where academic careers or research careers seem to be, to, I guess, most of us as lay people, still very much about excellence in one specific niche.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take that.
Gosh. So from a UK Space Agency perspective, naturally we have a very particular focus on catalysing investment and putting things up into orbit, but also championing space. And one project that we were involved with, that we led on, was this Space for All tour. So we took a 30-foot replica rocket So this was the Launcher 1 rocket from the Virgin Orbit, attempted launch from Spaceport Cornwall. And we took it on a tour around the country. So I think we visited 15 cities in total.
I think we had it for a bit.
Yes, you did. Yeah,
It didn't come to Swindon. I did ask.
It's well, we still have it at Cornwall, so you never know. At the city making ceremony, perhaps you'll get a visit from Launcher 1. But as part of that tour, and in itself, it is an art. It is you could argue that it is an art piece in itself, as well as an educational tool. But around it, we also did things like rocket making for children, and then they design their own rocket and then it'd be fired up into the air. So there's an artistic but also a playfulness about it. So people are engaging with science through art, through play. And also we had virtual reality headsets so people could get an idea of what it's like on other planets as well. So there is definitely scope for working with artist groups, with community groups, to tell that holistic story about science and how we understand our universe through those through these combined disciplines of science and art.
Yeah. So I'm going to, putting you on the spot, having had such actually an incredible debate, I've really enjoyed it. We're now pretty much on the hour, so you're going to have to be really profound and brief. But in reverse order down the panel, kind of any closing thoughts, anything you'd like to say, Phil?
So just to go back to that question, it's not so much the bringing of an example, but I think it's an invitation and a challenge to all of you in the room or everyone watching online. And it's feel able to go and talk to cultural organisations in your town or city or place and say to them, I've got this idea. What can you do about that? Or challenge them on what does science and technology mean to you? Because if you, as citizens, don't challenge cultural organisations to think more expansively, they'll keep on putting plays by Noel Coward, they'll keep doing old time musical, they'll do ornamental tapestry, things like that. And it's like, in terms of progress, cultural organisations always need new thoughts. And I think the more challenge they can have and the more they can be encouraged to think outside their conventional fields and parameters, the more prosperous the every sector, not just culture, but culture, science, the wider society will be.
Thank you, Tim.
Very quick story. After the Apollo moon landings, the astronauts were sent on publicity tours around the world. And Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, Mark Collins, these were military men, pilots, test pilots, and they lacked the knowledge and the understanding of art and communications to really convey this quite literally out-of-world experience that they had, this cosmic journey that they went under. And when Buzz Aldrin returned to Earth and when he went on these publicity tours, he was constantly asked, but how did it feel? How did it feel? And he could not put into words how it felt. And it broke him up. And he had a mental breakdown, he suffered from depression. And that was in part because we had someone engaging in a scientific pursuit, but who did not have that artistic temperament and training to then be able to tell that story to us back on Earth. And if you look at today's astronauts, at Megan Christian or John McFall or the Artemis NASA astronauts, they are all excellent communicators. They are all excellent at telling that story, and they are all trained in photography and public speaking, and that is so important if we are going to carry on having that buy-in for supporting these sorts of programs.
Roger.
I suppose just one thought at the back of my mind is that to have the humility to work with organisations and learn from them. And we've had a great partnership with colleagues in India and China on an exhibition about developing the COVID vaccine called Injecting Hope. A couple of million people have seen this exhibition so far. But the thing that blew me away was in India, they've got a whole different set of problems with rural communities and with very varying levels of literacy and many different languages. And so they came up with a touring puppet show as their answer to that problem. And I just thought it was just, it's just been, we've learned a lot from dealing partners, with different audiences and different outlooks. And I think that's really enriching, and that helps as well.
And Ottoline.
Yeah, so I maybe want to pick up on the point you made about losing control, in that across humanity in general, whether you're working in a research domain or not, I think one of the things people find most difficult is the unknown, uncertainty, insecurity, all of those things. I think research and innovation fundamentally are about how you go there, how you step into this unknown place where you don't know what the answer is, you don't know what will emerge. How do you do that well? And a lot of the tools we have in disciplinary research, but cross-disciplinary research, are to do with helping us do that. I think going into those unknown places in a kind of diverse team of people, all of whom can bring something different, that's a brilliant idea. It definitely helps you. And I think more broadly across society, again, bringing people, working, we own some of these really horrible problems like climate change and pandemics and so on. If we can take the kind of empowering opportunities from research and innovation to work together to address them, I think that's where we need to go. It is fundamentally about navigating that insecurity and uncertainty. Research and innovation will never get rid of that. It provides you with fantastic tools to navigate them, and that is completely disciplinary agnostic. You need all of those things to help you do that. And I guess that's how I would sum it up. We need to work together to navigate this unknown landscape in which we find ourselves.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to thank the audience for your questions and those online, because they've been brilliant and you're part of the debate. And finally, thank my incredible panel of guests who've been amazing. So round of applause.